If many of the late medieval heresies appeared to derive their inspiration from popular culture, that is, from ideas espoused by the common people, the same could not be said of heresy in England in the 14th century. Indeed, the perceived purveyor of religious dissent just happened to be the most prominent philosopher at Oxford University, John Wyclif. In several learned treatises, Wyclif castigated the Church and boldly declared the papacy an impious fiction and the monastic orders an invention of the devil. In one bold stroke, he laid siege to the pillars of medieval Christianity. Church authorities were roused to action. Wyclif went further and declared the Mass pure idolatry. Battle lines were drawn. His followers, a group known as the Lollars, appeared intent upon church reform, but before long, violence and strife broke out in the form of a rather bloody peasants' revolt. Today, most Christians have heard of the Wyclif Bible translators, but less is known of the man whose name survives to the present, and even less of the situation in the English church during the time of John Wyclif and the Lollards.
When he was alive, John Wyclif was seen as a spider sitting at the center of a web of intrigue and unrest, and at least two chroniclers in 14th century England characterized him thus. After he died, the spider's true role and identity was revealed. The devil's instrument, the church's enemy, the people's confusion, heretic's idol, hypocrite's mirror, schism's broacher, hatred's sower, lies' forger, flatterer's sink, who at his death despaired like Cain, and stricken by the horrible judgment of God, breathed forth his wicked soul to the dark mansions of the black devil. This was the epitaph written at St. Albans for John Wyclif by Thomas Walsingham. The question, of course, presents itself: what sort of a man could inspire such dark sentiment? We do not know when he was born. The date of his birth is somewhat uncertain. We think about 1329, and we know that he definitely died on the last day of the year 1384. Very little is known of his early life, but his family came under the protection of the Duke of Lancaster, John of Gaunt. Wyclif went to Oxford University early in his life to study, and he became a junior fellow at Merton College in 1356, where he took a BA degree in that year. And then he became the master of another Oxford school, Balliol College, sometime between 1356 and 1360. And then he moves into church work, as it were, becoming the vicar of Fillingham in Lincolnshire in 1361. He was then granted a license to study theology at Oxford in 1363. He secured a canonry, that's another ecclesiastical position, at Westbury-on-Trim in Gloucestershire, and a prebendary of Aust in 1362. And then, as if two jobs was not enough for Wyclif, he was presented with the rectory of Ludgershall in Buckinghamshire in 1368. Took a Bachelor of Divinity degree in 1369, and began 2 years later lecturing in theology at Oxford. In that same year, and this is very important, 1371, Wyclif got himself involved in English political affairs. King Edward III, who was reigning at the time, presented Wyclif with the Living of Lutterworth in 1374, and he was just prior to that promoted to the degree of doctor in 1372. So what we have here is a very busy and active academic personality who has been given responsibilities for several parishes. And I mentioned 4 of them here in the early going. Now you have to ask yourself, How can one man fill the pulpits of 4 churches at the same time? Now, by all accounts, John Wyclif was a brilliant scholar, a leading teacher of philosophy, and a compelling teacher. He was a significant theological thinker, as we will see in due course, and I don't think it's exaggerating to say he was the only first-rate philosopher at Oxford in the later 14th century. Now, important for some comments later, to state at this stage that Wyclif held pro-government and nationalistic views. It's not anachronistic to use those terms. He said that civil government should seize the property of immoral clerics. The government should take their property from them. Now, there was a lot of animosity, I have to tell you, between the kings of England and the popes in Rome. For example, Pope Clement VI remarked in the year 1345 concerning the appointment of one Thomas Hatfield to the See of Durham. And the Pope said this: "If the English king were to petition for his ass to be made bishop, we could not say him nay." Now, that's a significant comment. The Pope is saying even if the king wanted his donkey to be appointed bishop, we couldn't say no to him. Okay, that suggests the power of the English monarchs and the turmoil with the popes. I mentioned these pro-government and nationalistic views. Wyclif develops ideas on what we would call today lordship, on authority. His theory of dominion suggested that on certain instances, under certain circumstances, the government could usurp authority over the church. Now, from what we've studied thus far in medieval history, it should be clear to you that this is simply another chapter in this unfolding drama of tensions between church and state. The influence of Marsilio of Padua and Richard Fitzralph on Wyclif, on this matter of dominion, is crucial. Wyclif's preoccupation with the subject of lordship, with authority, is developed in several of his books from the mid-1370s. And there were raging theological and philosophical debates at Oxford and elsewhere which were influencing Wyclif's developing thought. And I have to also say at this point that he railed, I think that's the word to use, he absolutely railed against the immorality of the priesthood, of monks and clerics, and he becomes, and this will be very important for further developments in 14th century England, he becomes anti-papal. Now, you know what happens to would-be reformers. He began to gather to himself attention, some of it unwanted, and gathering enemies. In 1377, John Wyclif is summoned to London to answer charges. He was on this occasion opposed by William Courtenay, who would later be elevated as Archbishop of Canterbury, the most powerful church office in the entire realm. In the same year, the plot thickens, 1377, and Wyclif is condemned by the sitting Pope Gregory XI, who issued a list of Wyclif's errors. It is the protection of John of Gaunt and of Joan, who is the widow of the Black Prince, another important personality in late medieval England, that spared Wyclif from any serious prosecution. I mean, when you get a pope publishing a list of your errors and summoning you to the capital to answer charges, in 14th century Europe, you need to be, shall we say, apprehensive. You need to be careful about whose toes you're stepping on. In 1378, he published his book on the Scriptures, in which he argues for the absolute superiority of the Bible over theology and over scholasticism. Now, this was not sola scriptura. We'll be dealing with the Reformation in due course. I do not wish to give any impression that Wyclif was a Bible-only man. What I am trying to say is that Wyclif elevated Scripture to a place of primacy. But just because you've got number one does not mean that all of your other authorities fall away. But it was his book in 1380 on the sacrament, on the Eucharist, which would cost Wyclif dearly. Because from 1381 onwards, he was mainly at Lutterworth, his parish, writing. And at 1382, the so-called Earthquake Synod was held in London at Blackfriars, called the Earthquake Synod because during the time the council was sitting, an earthquake struck London. Remember William Courtenay, who I mentioned, who had opposed Wyclif? Courtenay is now the Archbishop. He presides over this Earthquake Synod. 24 articles of Wyclif's teachings are declared heretical. Now, Wyclif wasn't actually excommunicated, and he remains unmolested at Lutterworth. Once again, we have to wonder why he seems to be getting off the hook. Let me say something about his further works before I conclude his biography and then move into his significance for the late medieval church. His prolific works fall into two main categories. Those which on one hand might be regarded as philosophical, and another body of works which we should regard as theological. These make up the corpus of the Wyclifite canon. In these books, Wyclif teaches very clearly that human law is valid only to the extent that it's based upon divine law. He rejects the papal office in a 1379 book. He later refers to Pope Gregory XI as the horrendus diabolus, the horrible devil. For Wyclif, in defining the church, he says that the church is made up of the congregation of all of the predestined who've been elected to salvation by God. In other words, the church is made up of ordinary people, not just of popes and bishops and church hierarchy, as others would want to define it. He develops this idea of the church as the community of the predestined in another book titled Concerning the Church in 1379. Another point, theological, that is significant is his rejection of the teaching of transubstantiation, which we know Lateran IV had promulgated in 1215. He simply dismisses that. Now, part of the reason for it is beyond the scope of this particular course and this lecture. It's philosophical. And because of his realist leanings, and you can read about realism and nominalism, and because Wyclif is a realist, he has to reject transubstantiation. It's this posture, his anti-mass stance, that costs him the most, and it's what brings him the most severe and sustained condemnation. Because after his attack on the sacrament in 1380, Wyclif loses the support of John of Gaunt, who previously had been such an important ally for Wyclif's work in terms of protecting him. And John of Gaunt had tremendous political pull in 14th century England. And ultimately, Wyclif is kicked out. He's expelled from Oxford University altogether. After Wyclif specifically, I want to ask this question now. Who in the world were the Lollards? I've mentioned the name once or twice. You often hear of them in late medieval England, and they're often associated with Wyclif. Who were they? Well, the easy answer is that traditionally this group of people was thought to be the followers of John Wyclif. Some historians have suggested that perhaps Lollardy never existed at all, that it is exactly a creation of historians, that it was just a disparate group of people that had no inner cohesion or organization at all. Be that as it may, I think that's a bit extreme. I think there were some people who probably fit into the Lollard category. They arose in that troubled age, late medieval Europe, in which sedition and dissent merged frequently, and socio-political revolt joined hands with ecclesiastical reform. And sometimes you've got movements for reform coming from opposite directions and forming some union in the middle. Fears which had been confirmed in 1381 continued to be directed towards the shadowy and elusive entity that some people called Lollards. And those fears only deepened as the years went on. So we have turmoil, we have pessimism, together with social upheaval in late medieval England, which produces a mood of radicalism. Now we can see this down through history and right up to the present time. When you put these social and political factors together, you can have revolt, which can sometimes lead to revolution. Opposition to the church, of course, didn't begin with Wyclif, but it was promoted and facilitated by Wyclif. And the papal schism must certainly have added contempt in the popular mind when you've got 2 and then 3 popes all competing with each other. William of Ockham, an English Franciscan thinker of the 14th century, argued against the greed and the corruption of the contemporary church. And in this, he's sounding the same alarm as Wyclif. Now, Ockham, and I won't go into his history, he was also, though, an enemy of papal authority. His was but one voice among many in late medieval Europe, suggesting that the church needed to be reformed, it needed to be divested of its wealth, either willingly or otherwise, and the Pope had to withdraw from political and worldly matters. But the popes were not really amenable to this sort of suggestion. Now there was a decline for these and other reasons in confidence in the established ecclesiastical order. And mysticism, which we have looked at previously, reached some prominence. And I make reference to Julian of Norwich, one of the most famous of the late medieval English mystics. Now, we've had theological critique and philosophical critique coming from, say, the pens of Wyclif and William of Ockham. There were also literary critiques. First, there was William Langland, who died around the year 1390, in his book, The Ploughman. He condemned the corrupt clergy, denounced the Franciscans, denounced the Dominicans for their greed. He condemned the theologians for their complexity, for this painful scholastic understanding of the Christian faith. He decried the papacy for its negative influence upon simple Christians. He condemned the wealthy for their arrogance and their avarice. He criticized people in power for their selfish cruelty. It's a literary critique. And like Ockham, like Wyclif, he suggested that the church should return to its original place of apostolic poverty. We have other critiques. Another famous one is Geoffrey Chaucer, who lived from about 1343 to 1400, and his book, The Canterbury Tales, is still read in literature classes in the English-speaking world to this day. The Canterbury Tales portray a number of prevalent church-type people within its pages. We have the superficial prioress. She would be the head of a nunnery, a convent. There's the pardoner in Chaucer, who's essentially a seller of indulgences. There's the lecherous summoner who plays a role. There's the monk who's addicted to the pleasures of the hunt. And we have the corrupt friar, who is sometimes shown just as an average friar, but then in some of these funny little pictures, you pulled up the flap of paper which effectively pulled up his habit and exposed his corruption. And there was, of course, the influence of John Wyclif, which I have been speaking to. One more quote from Wyclif before we turn to one of the most interesting and seminal events of later medieval England. But firstly, Wyclif writes, "All good things of God ought to be in common." Now, I want to read on just a little bit in Wyclif, because I think this quotation, coming from an Oxford philosopher and theologian, is essential for understanding what happens in England in 1381. He says, all good things of God ought to be held in common. The proof of this is as follows. Every man ought to be in a state of grace. If he is in a state of grace, he is Lord of the world and all that it contains. Therefore, every man ought to be Lord of the whole world. But, there's always a but, because of the multitudes of men, this will not happen unless they hold all things in common, because all things ought to be in common. Now, in other words, to put that into plain, simple English, the growing disparity between the rich and the poor has to go. This is at the root of the problem. This is Wyclif, writing in the 1370s. Now, while Wyclif condemned the extremes of the revolt, he did state, and I'm speaking of the peasants' revolt, he did state that the majority of their demands were justified, though he condemns the extremes. We go to an individual now named John Ball, who died in 1381. John Ball was a priest who promoted social egalitarianism, which sounds very much like what Wyclif was promoting. John Ball had been a secular priest at St. Mary's in York, probably was a chantry priest, and we know that Ball was imprisoned twice by Archbishop Sudbury for unorthodox preaching. Now, John Ball, whether he's deliberately leaning on Wyclif or not, is going to be one of the main players in a literal social revolution in England. According to Ball, now, not tomorrow, not next year, but now is the time to adhere to the Scriptures. Oh, we've been preaching this our whole lives. We've been teaching and preaching and thinking and praying, and now's the time to practice what we preach, Ball said. Put the wheat into the barn and destroy the tares, destroy the weeds. What are the tares of society, Preacher Ball? The question is put, and he says, the tares of society are the evil lords, the unjust judges, and the lawyers. It's time to get rid of all of them. Well, many of the common people in England, and I dare say even in our own times, many of the common people would say, amen, that's exactly what we need to do. They gladly received the words, the suggestions of Ball, and they said he should be made archbishop. This is what he should do. Let's make John Ball the archbishop and make him the chancellor in the place of Simon Sudbury, who is the sitting Archbishop of Canterbury, whom they considered a traitor. Now, these rebels issued a demand to the king to execute John of Gaunt, whom I've mentioned, and 15 other traitors. Now, this is serious. We've got a bunch of rebels in England who are calling for the heads of the Archbishop of Canterbury, as well as 15 other traitors, including John of Gaunt. Now, the Duke of Lancaster, that's John of Gaunt, was out of reach in the north of England, and the others were with the king in London. Sudbury, the Archbishop and the king, were taking refuge in the Tower of London. The peasants marched on London. In June of 1381, they opened the prisons, let the prisoners out, occupied the homes of the rich and famous, if you will, destroyed property. Now, we've got a riot going on in London, and they told the king, who's Richard II, that they wanted charters. They wanted legal governmental charters to free them from their serfdom. What we've got here is Wyclif and Ball's ideology put into practice by a multitude of peasants. Now, much destruction was perpetrated against the property and the lives of the upper classes in England. Let me pause to remind you of the question that I departed on. What were the social and political implications of the teachings and preachings of John Wyclif? Well, is it just coincidence that we now have a riot in London? Or did the peasants actually hear what Wyclif had to say and have now moved into revolutionary posture? I leave it to you to sort it out. But now, back to the streets of London, June 1381, where we have got a peasant mob. Nay, we've got several peasant mobs who have marched on London from different directions, who've converged on the banks of the Thames, and by God, they're going to have something for their efforts. The Palace of the Savoy, right on the banks of the Thames. John of Gaunt's private residence was sacked. Wat Tyler, who was one of the leaders, tried to control his men. I'll give Wat Tyler the credit. He tried to control them, but some of them were simply intent upon plunder and upon booty, and they weren't interested, it seems, in the objectives of the revolt at all, which was social egalitarianism and justice. To make a point, Tyler had one of his men arrested, who was caught stealing a gold goblet, and he put him to death right there in front of the mob and said, "This is not what we have come to town to do." Tyler asked that the goods of the Holy Church not remain in the hands of the religious. But things went from bad to worse. You know what happens in revolutions. The peasants took the Tower. It's pretty tough to take the Tower of London, but they got in there. And they immediately captured Sudbury and Robert Hales. Archbishop Sudbury was beheaded on the spot. And others, especially Robert Hales, who was the king's treasurer, and a friar, they were also put to the sword, and their heads were put on sharp sticks and carried round London, which makes the point, and the pun is intended. Here we come. The Archbishop's head on a sharp stick. We mean business. We didn't come to London just to negotiate. We spent our whole lives listening to your nonsense. We want action. We want to see the gospel of Jesus Christ put into practice. Well, Sudbury's execution on the 14th day of June prompted John Ball to come back into London, and he was there on hand for the execution. There's other things going on, but I digress to say that the chronicler Thomas Walsingham alleged that the executioner who'd actually beheaded Simon Sudbury soon experienced divine vengeance. I'm reading from Walsingham's chronicle, and was driven mad and struck blind. Elsewhere, Walsingham tells us that the man, who he identifies as either John or Thomas Starling, was seized by the devil and went mad. Well, that's one way of explaining divine vengeance. But the heads were carried through the city on long poles and put on London Bridge. What in the world was King Richard II to do? About 150 people were actually beheaded. The rioting continued. I should tell you that King Richard II was all of 14 years of age, at the time of this crisis. He went out and met the rebels at Smithfield on the 15th of June. Wat Tyler was killed on the spot, and the king, to his 14-year-old credit, was able to bring the crisis to a halt. John Ball fled. He was captured at Coventry. He was hanged, drawn, quartered, and beheaded. He refused to submit. He refused to ask the king for pardon, and he did freely acknowledge his role in the English peasants' revolt. He was put to death in the aforementioned fashion on the 15th of July. William Courtenay, whom I've mentioned previously, succeeds Sudbury in Canterbury and lost no time in stating that social upheaval could only be dealt with in one way, and that was with the extermination of religious heresy. And I think you know what Courtenay had in mind. Now, around 1390, if we move past Wyclif, if we move past this revolt, we have three strands of Lollardy, which I've defined earlier as being the followers of John Wyclif. The first one is academic heresy. Basically at Oxford, I can cut to the chase and tell you that if there was academic heresy at Oxford, it was over and done with by about 1420. The second strand was among the gentry or the aristocracy. These were connected to the king and to the court, and we can't possibly be speaking of more than 8 to 10 individuals, so not really that big of a deal. And then thirdly, popular Lollardy. This is the common people preaching out of doors, in the streets. It's localized. It isn't widespread. Now, in terms of the academic heresy, and I'm speaking of Wyclif's legacy, there doesn't seem to be any survival of Lollardy in Oxford once Wyclif is gone. We do have people like Nicholas Hereford, who preached that Simon Sudbury got what he deserved, you know, the old head chopped off on the sharp stick carried through the streets. He got what he deserved, Hereford preached. John Purvey, whom Henry Knighton, the chronicler, called the fourth heresiarch, the arch-heretic, and Peter Payne, who would have later a long and successful career among heretics in Bohemia. There were a few other academically inclined persons. But this heresy among the gentry is pretty oblique. There's not really personal ties to Wyclif. And it's important to point out that essentially these individuals were immune from prosecution because of their ties to the king and to the royal court. They were effectively covert and silent for the most part in their heresies. So the popular movement, which is really perhaps the only one with any vitality, is underground. And it's both urban and rural. If you look at a map of Lollard, England, you will find the concentration in East Anglia, up towards Coventry, and in that general area. These are cell groups of people reading Lollard books, schools of heresy, a lot of hostility to the church, particularly on transubstantiation, and here they're following Wyclif's lead. Now, in radical Lollardy, the laity, including women, could preach in the absence of priests. And the Lollards grew in number, Henry Knighton tells us. He says, they fill the whole kingdom. They become so bold that in public places they shamelessly barked like dogs with unwearying voices. Well, I can tell you this is hyperbole. It's exaggeration. The Lollards were never, Henry Knighton aside, never that significant in England. In 1395, they published their 12 conclusions, attaching them to the doors of St. Paul's Cathedral in London and also Westminster Abbey. These outline the Lollard faith, and effectively it sounds like Wyclif in lay terms. The priesthood of Rome is not the priesthood of Jesus. Clerical celibacy is stupid. Come on, get with the program. Sexual immorality is bad, on the other hand, too, they said. Transubstantiation is pious nonsense. They said there's too much ritual, excessive church paraphernalia. And clerics should have nothing to do with temporal power and authority. They want kind of a separation of church and state. And they're really going against the grain of late medieval England. Prayers for the dead, pilgrimages, and confession are just simply unnecessary. Capital punishment and war is contrary to the New Testament. Now, this doesn't fit too well with the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 and the Lollar literature I should say something about. There's a whole body of literature which survives. There's a cycle of sermons, 294 sermons in all. There's a Lollard Bible, pamphlets, English translations of Wyclif's writings, biblical commentaries, and polemical texts have existed from the 14th century down to the present. Let me give you a comparison to put this into perspective. There were 250 manuscripts of the Lollard Bible which survived. 250, it's an extraordinary number. Doesn't mean anything to you until I give you something to compare it with. You've all heard of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. I referred to them earlier. Guess how many manuscripts survive of the Canterbury Tales? 64. 64 of them, 250 of the Lollard Bible. You figure it out. I would suggest that as popular as Chaucer was, the Bible was all that more popular. Well, by 1409, Archbishop Arundel found it necessary to proceed against the Lollards. His constitutions, which he published, addresses the Lollard problem. He says heresy is spreading at an absolutely frightening rate. Got to do something about it. Nobody shall preach without a license. That'll fix these men and women going around. No, if you haven't got a license, you don't preach. Anybody preaching without a license will result in that entire town being placed under interdict. Well, that puts the onus on you and you. And you too, because if somebody preaches in your town without a license, you're going to suffer. So we're all going to be members of the God Squad, and we are going to enforce the will of Archbishop Arundel. No book or tract composed by John Wyclif or anybody else in his time or since shall be read in schools, halls, hostels, or in fact anywhere at all. Anybody caught possessing, reading, promoting this sort of thing is going to get their knuckles cracked. Yeah, that's putting it nicely. Furthermore, Arundel said translation of the Bible into English is strictly prohibited. Not going to have it. And there'll be no public or private disputation about the Catholic faith except for the purpose of understanding and accepting them more fully. Now, if you can pull this off, this is going to put to an end pretty quickly a popular movement of dissent. The question is this: is the heresy spreading in England because of negligence and incompetence on the part of the authorities? Or is it because of the strength and the vitality of the movement itself? Richard II was deposed in 1399, and in the following year died under mysterious circumstances. John of Gaunt also died in 1399. It seems to be that the angel of death was coming to prominent places in England. And there was none, as I mentioned previously, no means of dealing with heresy. There was no Inquisition in England, no political machinery to combat the heresy. And not until 1401 and the decree concerning the burning of heretics is there legislation to actually deal with heresy. So we could put it this way: by the early 15th century, Lollardy has retained dangerous political and social implications, together with ideas for religious reform. There were many proposals put forward between 1395 and 1410 concerning the disendowing of monasteries. In 1410, Parliament finally gave some consideration, but as you may know, we'll have to wait for Henry VIII, more than 100 years later, before monasteries will actually be dissolved. Radicalism continued to rear its head. Thomas Walsingham tells us that a near riot erupted in London in 1387 after one of the Augustinian friars was accused by one of their own of a whole variety of improprieties. According to Walsingham, nearly 100 Lollards congregated in London, shouting, "Let us rout these murderers, burn these sodomites, and hang these traitors." We're talking about a bunch of monks. The sheriff had to intervene, and nothing really came of the protest. Lollards in Leicester were accused of using a wooden statue of St. Catherine for fuel and for referring to two famous images of the Blessed Virgin Mary as the Witch of Lincoln and the Witch of Walsingham. Now that's going to get the attention of the church, and the authorities regarded such acts as undertaken only by people possessed by the devil and his minions. Well, Lollards, for all of this fits and starts and bursts of radicalism and rhetoric and things being posted on church doors and statues being burned, I have to tell you, never made up more than a tiny segment of the population. The anti-clerical attitude was pretty pervasive. The emphasis upon the Bible as opposed to the church remained pretty constant. An emphasis upon direct relations with God. A denial of pilgrimages, offering to images, invocation of saints. Basically, it's kind of an in-your-face, anti-official religion point of view. And even recent work has undermined some previous assumptions that women played central and pervasive roles in Lollardy. It now appears to be that it just ain't so. According to the Oxford scholar Anne Hudson, her book titled The Premature Reformation, Lollardy was a failure. Let's come back to Wyclif to conclude. John Wyclif learned a pretty important lesson from the storms of 1381, referring principally to the Peasants' Revolt, which convulsed southeast England. He said, "Now it is said, secular lords can remove temporalities from a delinquent church, which would after all be more sensible than peasants taking the life of that church's primate." Well, almost a half-century after his death, as I referred earlier, his slim remains were cremated. And his enemies, both church and secular, thought that they were rid of him and had seen the last of both him and his ideas. But the historian Thomas Fuller put it this way: "They burnt his bones to ashes, and they cast them into Swift, a neighboring brook running hard by to Lutterworth. Thus this brook hath conveyed his ashes into Avon," a bigger river, "Avon into Severn, Severn into the narrow seas, and they into the main ocean. And thus the ashes of Wyclif are the emblem of his doctrine, which is now dispersed the world over."